Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Breast Cancer Physio. I'm your host Jen McKenzie, lymphedema physiotherapist and ESSA accredited exercise physiologist. In this episode I'm going to be talking to my wonderful guest presenter Julie Bolton, who is a breast cancer counsellor. So thank you so much for coming on today, Julie. In this episode we're going to be covering the topic, why do I get teary after breast cancer? Now we're not just talking about straight after diagnosis, we're talking about during and after treatment, because this can affect so many people who get diagnosed with breast cancer. So if you enjoy this content and you would like to see more, then please subscribe to my channel, which is completely free. Give this video a big thumbs up and leave a comment in the section below if you have any questions on the emotional impacts around breast cancer. If you would like me to direct any questions towards Julie, we can also do that for you. Okay, so before we get started, Jules, just tell us a little bit about yourself, because you are a breast cancer survivor as well of nearly 9 years, which gives you this incredible skill set in the weirdest of ways, being a survivor and having that lived experience, but then also combining that lived experience with becoming a counsellor and essentially a counsellor of cancer patients as well. How did you come to be that person?
Well, it's a long story, but basically at 46 years of age I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and so like most people will be watching this video, that was a terrible shock. And soon after that, obviously you go through surgery. In my case, the treatment regime was chemotherapy, radiation therapy, hormone treatment, and then when all of that was over, I really felt that I was struggling to get back to the way things were before. And I met a whole lot of other people through my own experience who I noticed were going through the same kind of things. And so I became really interested in finding out more about all of that, and I felt that we'd come so far in terms of with technology and being able to diagnose and treat people, but I felt we still had a long way to go in terms of looking after and supporting people's emotional health, not only during their treatment but especially in that transition period afterwards, because that's when a lot of people really find it difficult. It's a period of great uncertainty. They're often adjusting to after effects of treatment, but more than anything, which is what we're here to talk about today, they often feel very emotional and very teary, or it could be really angry as well, and they don't really know why, and that can be quite scary. And I think it's important for people to understand what's actually happening, and that's quite normal at this stage.
And as you and I have discussed before, I think the really positive thing that can come out of this video for viewers is that when I refer my patients as a physiotherapist to Julie, particularly in the context of being easily emotionally triggered, and you go through this explanation that we're going to talk about in a minute, the relief that these people feel is quite profound, because when they understand why they're getting teary or emotional, it's an amazing help.
Absolutely.
So off that, talk about this beautiful concept called the window of tolerance to us.
Happy to. I think this is really important for people to understand. So I'm just going to show you a diagram of what's called in psychology a window of tolerance. And on this graph, you've got a representation of our functioning of our nervous system when it's not under any extraordinary external stresses. And so we find that the nervous system activates, you get up and get going in the morning, and then you have a period of settling or relaxing, but overall tending to stay within what we call that window of tolerance. However, what happens when we experience something like a diagnosis of cancer, we get a terrible fright. It's like we go into shock, and so it overwhelms our nervous system. So looking at the second graph here, when you experience that shock, that when the whole world turns upside down, when you hear those words, you have cancer, you might have experienced a sensation of complete panic, sheer overwhelm, anxiety, fear. That's this area up here, which we call the hyper-aroused state, so the nervous system's overstimulated. Sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes we go into this area down here, which is called, down the bottom, which is called hypo-aroused state. So you might have felt completely numb, just shock, can't really function properly, feel a bit surreal, like you're not really there. And both of these are perfectly normal reactions to extreme stress. So we have, our body is designed to be able to survive through periods of danger. So we have this little part in our brain called the amygdala, which is like a smoke detector. So it detects threat in our environment. So as soon as we feel, our brain senses danger, the amygdala sends us into what you would have heard of, a fight or flight response. Technically it should be fight, flight or freeze. So to briefly explain that, back in the days of the saber-toothed tiger, when the tiger's running at you, you either have to stay and fight the tiger or you've got to run as fast as you can. And so we still have that very old part of our brain, the reptilian part of the brain, which automatically has that response to danger. We also have a freeze response, which is where the body just basically shuts down and it's difficult to move or to function. You don't get to choose what happens, the brain just does that automatically. So, in terms of receiving a cancer diagnosis and everything that follows from that, with all the months of grueling treatment and all the after effects to deal with, it's not an instant danger that's gone in 5 minutes like the tiger attack. And so people can find that they are up in this fight or flight response, which is up in this hyper-aroused state, or down in this freeze response for long periods of time. So this response down here is where you feel quite disconnected, like you're functioning on autopilot, like you're a bit disconnected from what's happening, like the world's going on out there without you.
Almost like you're spectating, I'm guessing, is that you're a passenger?
Yeah, like it's a bit surreal. And often people can relate to this top area here, because that's often an initial response, but also over a long period of time, just that incredible anxiety and overwhelm and fear, and with that is this emotional flooding. So we have this teariness, and we're triggered easily into this teariness, or it can be rage and anger. So it's a very emotional state, and that's because when we experience trauma, that window of tolerance basically shrinks. And so it's much easier for us to trigger up here or down here. And we can go from the top zone to the bottom zone within a day, or we can spend weeks and weeks up in this fight or flight mode, and then the body just says, oh, that's too hard. Like, it's absolutely exhausting to be up in that fight or flight mode. I was just feeling anxious.
I was just about to say that, obviously a lot of our patients will describe fatigue as part of their treatment. Yes. But when you understand the background to the window of tolerance and being outside that window, if your adrenaline is pumping the whole time, which is designed obviously to run away from the tiger, if you're in that for chronic periods, then you're going to deplete your adrenal sources, and this could be a really big part of fatigue for
Absolutely,
patients.
I really do believe that. And when we go into that fight or flight response, as you mentioned, Jen, we have these stress hormones, so we have adrenaline and we have cortisol. So if you're up here for long periods of time, up in this fight or flight state, you have high levels of cortisol in your body, which we know impact on basically every system of our body. It reduces our immune system, it can impact our cardiovascular system, it can certainly impact our ability to focus, concentrate, remember things, think straight. Because while you're up in fight or flight, your brain can't concentrate on anything else but the danger, the perceived threat. And
could this also be part of the brain fog that happens, Jules?
Absolutely.
Where if somebody said to me once that when you're angry, that your IQ starts to drop, or when you're highly emotional, it's like your intelligence levels go down as the emotion goes up. And I'm wondering, is that potentially part of brain fog, or the inability to think clearly?
I think that brain fog is another whole topic which we will get to.
Yes.
But your IQ doesn't change, even though it feels like it has. But certainly your ability to perform certain cognitive functions changes. And that's a multifaceted story, which we'll get to in that other video, but certainly one of the contributing factors can be when you're up in that fight or flight zone, then you can't think about anything else. So it's more that you're not able to pay attention because you're thinking about, I've got an appointment tomorrow, I've got to scan the next week, rather than a memory issue, even though a lot of people fear that they are getting Alzheimer's. I know I certainly felt like that at the time.
Yeah. So following that description of, what the window of tolerance is and the hyper and the hypo, Jules, why is it good to be in the window of tolerance?
Yeah, that's a very good question. When we're in the window of tolerance, that is our optimal functioning. So that's where we feel calm, we feel connected to others, because it's very hard to be connected to other people when you're up in that fight or flight response. In our window of tolerance, we can make logical, rational decisions. Everything is just more settled. And so we feel that, we can function at our best. And it's not a nice feeling to be up in fight or flight for long periods of time. We feel so anxious and overwhelmed and on edge, as if everything's dangerous, and we don't feel like we're coping because we feel like we're easily triggered into tears or rage, and it can happen at the drop of a hat and we don't feel like we have control over that. However, the good news is we do have some control over that. And the first step is knowledge and understanding of what's happening. And the second step is learning strategies and skills to be able to bring you back into that window of tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
So we can certainly, I'll just share another graph with you here. So we've talked about those three zones, the hyper-aroused state, the fight and flight response, the window of tolerance, which is where we want to be, and then we've got this hypo-aroused state down the bottom here, which is where the body often shuts down because it can't stand to be up in this awful state of hypervigilance and overwhelm and anxiety. So it just needs a break sometimes, like, I just need to, I just need to stop for a while.
Down tools. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's a bit sad in a way though, isn't it? It's because it's literally the body sort of saying, okay, I'm putting up the stop sign, I'm going to shut down for a little while, which must be very confusing for people around the person who's going through breast cancer. It might be confusing for the person who's going through breast cancer because one minute they must feel, like a cat on a hot tin roof, for a really good Aussie saying. And then the next minute, really quite disconnected, and that's a real emotional roller coaster to go through, isn't it? And
it's like the body does this without us deciding to do it, but it's like the body can't bear to be in that state for any longer. So we go to the opposite, which is like numb and withdrawn. You feel socially withdrawn. You don't feel like interacting with people. A lot of people talk about that in the aftermath of their cancer experience. They find it quite difficult to start engaging in their pre-cancer social interaction again, and that can be related to a lot of things. Confidence, which is another big thing that I would like to talk about one day. We lose a lot of confidence sometimes through our experience.
That would actually be a great video topic to do, because I definitely can see that. I hear that story often with my breast cancer survivors, that once it's time to return to normal life, so to speak, once active treatment's finished, they're getting either back to work or just normal socialising or whatnot. That transition itself can be tricky,
absolutely,
for that reason.
And often it's because we're still up in that fight or flight zone or in the freeze zone. And so the good news is that we can learn to do something about this. So for my final graph, what we're trying to do is give you the skills and strategies to bring you from this hyper-arousal at the top here down into this window of tolerance. And in my experience, there are a couple of ways that you can do that, but I believe that the number one way to do that is to learn about mindfulness and learn some mindfulness skills and strategies. And within a very short period of time, you can absolutely bring yourself down from this hyper-aroused state or the fight and flight response down into the window of tolerance. So that's something that you might like to think about. I certainly run some beginners mindfulness courses. They run for 5 weeks, once a week, for about an hour at a time, and I just keep those groups small. And I run some of those at the Mackenzie Clinic, but I'm also now doing some of those online for people who live further away or who might not feel up to coming into the clinic. And I have found those to be extremely helpful, and people constantly report how much better they feel because they're now back into that window of tolerance and they've learned a skill that they can use for life.
Yeah, there's so many really wonderfully straightforward mindfulness techniques, isn't there, that people can engage with. And again, this could be a second video that we can follow up from this video on with just a handful of mindfulness techniques I think that are super basic, can help people so quickly to bring themselves out of this state. But I think, the reason we wanted to do this video, of course, was just to bring the awareness about why people are so emotional, what is the window of tolerance, and also that there's some fantastic education to be provided around these topics. Having awareness, I imagine, Jules, is an immediate relief.
Absolutely.
For the patients.
Because it does two things. It validates what you're going through, and it normalises it to some extent. Normalises it for people who've been through that traumatic event, because having a diagnosis of breast cancer and having to go through treatment is a traumatic event. And I think we don't actually sometimes stop to realise the impact of that on our physical and emotional health.
On that note, that's a really good point. One of the things I wanted to ask you, as you were talking, I was thinking about this, and one of the things I find is that if you address the somewhat obvious mental impacts to a patient who is going through breast cancer, so if you say to them, how's your mental health going, or how are you feeling, you can sometimes see that they may be not keen to dive down that topic at that point in time. But there's a definitive sign, or there's definitive signs to us as health professionals that they might not be handling the situation very well. So I suppose what I'm getting to here is that you can be almost suppressing your awareness of being either hypo or hyper aroused. So that must be a problem in itself, where people go, I know I'm not right, but I'm just going to squash that feeling and pretend to be okay, essentially is what I'm
That's a very, very common experience for people. And I think they just feel, because you're up in that fight or flight zone, you're feeling so much overwhelmed with the whole experience, and there's so much fear. There's fear around what's happening to me, why am I feeling like this, what's wrong with me. There's a lot of fear around that, and so people, as you said, are often just trying to, I call it shoving down that feeling of fear, or we distract ourselves however we can to try not to feel, because it's not nice to feel in that situation. One thing I'd just like to say is that it's not really about a mental health condition. There's no need to sort of label this as a mental health problem. It's just that it's a normal emotional response to the life circumstances that they're in. And I think that's an important distinction.
So important, isn't it?
This is what you would expect, and that everyone's going to go through when they have been diagnosed and had to go through what they've been through. And so the good news is then it's very simple to manage that and to dampen down that response, so that we can feel in that zone where we feel much calmer and happier and more relaxed again, which hopefully is good news for a lot of people.
I think that last point you mentioned there, Jules, is so important, because there's still a lot of stigma around mental health, and it's like you said, it's not like we're talking about mental illness here. We are literally talking about a normal human reaction to a really traumatic situation. But the ability of the person to be aware of those reactions, and then to understand those reactions, and then to be able to act on those actions, that's where you really can become empowered as the person going through that traumatic experience. So, so that's a really good point. Thank you so much for coming on today,
that's
Jules.
great.
I really
Thank you.
appreciate that. If people would like more information on you, where can they find you?
So go to my website at www.julieboltoncounselling.com, or my Facebook page, or my email address if they want to contact me directly.
Yep.
I think you
Yep.
said you might.
What we'll do, guys, is we'll leave some links to Julie's website, Facebook page and email in the description bar below this video, and I'll pop this up on the screen now for you as well. So we're actually going to get Julie back in a couple of weeks to do a video on brain fog, which will be another really hot topic that I think a lot of people will be interested in.
Yeah.
That's definitely a topic I get questions on every single week in the clinic. So yeah. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've gained some great information off this video today. I hope you're having a wonderful week wherever you are. I'll be back next week with another video. I'm Jen McKenzie, the Breast Cancer Physio, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.